Welcome back to Cognitive Processes. Now I'd like to talk about the reconstructive nature of memory. So if you remember from the previous lecture, I talked a little bit about Jacobi's false fame studies. And those studies really did seem to illustrate that memory is a reconstructive process and it relies on feeling states. So when you are retrieving information from memory, and you're thinking about whether a name is famous or not, you're relying on a feeling of fluency, a feeling of familiarity. Those feeling states are what you are using when you're making judgments about whether a name is famous or not. And if you've seen the name before, and it's not even a famous person, but if you've seen the name before and it feels fluent, it feels like it's a familiar name, then you judge it as famous. So what that tells you is that memory is not a static recording. It's an active process of rebuilding or reassembling of past events. And memory is influenced by current beliefs, by knowledge, and external information, making memory susceptible to distortion. And we can even have creation of false memories, like we see in the false fame study. It doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with your memory. It's probably an indication of the fact that your brain is efficient. It's not going to store every tiny little detail. It's going to rely on some information that generally makes sense, but it does mean that sometimes we will see errors. So is this new information? No, the idea that we use other information to reconstruct memory goes back to the 1930s. There was actually a classic study in 1932 that's still fairly famous called the War of Ghosts study by Bartlett. And Bartlett rejected the laboratory study of memory, arguing that real world memories use world knowledge and frameworks. You don't come into a study just, with an empty brain. You have your life experience and you bring that to a memory test. And so we use schemata to organize information. And so how do we know this? Well, even back in the 1930s, Bartlett used a method of serial reproduction to study memory. He asked participants to recall stories on more than one occasion. And so participants were first asked to recall a Native American folk tale and then retell it a bunch of times. This was about a legend. And what happened is that the subjects retelling the story over and over again made the story more similar to their own culture and their own beliefs. So the story changed with retellings. And when the change happened, the shift was consistent with what the person is bringing to the table in terms of their own background, their own culture, their own existing beliefs. So, is this something that is really strange? No, of course not. In the real world, it would make sense that we use all this information that we bring to the table when we reconstruct our memories. So, when you think about autobiographical memory, our real world memories are much more durable than laboratory memories where we just give people the random lists of words to remember. Some items are forgotten because they are hard to distinguish from similar memories. And, that's fine. Sometimes it doesn't make sense to have incredible amounts of detail of things that don't matter all that much. Another thing that we find in asking people about their autobiography is that single event memories are often combined into extended or summarized events. That's okay too. Like, you think you have this very distinctive memory from your childhood, but perhaps it was sort of an amalgamation of a couple of different things that happened in your childhood. And then over time, it just becomes this one memory for you. The interesting thing is that rare actions are more likely to be recalled than frequent actions. So if something that happened to you was super distinctive, you probably will remember that in greater detail than other things that were like sort of similar to other things you did all the time. Then you wouldn't really have a distinctive memory for that specific event because it's so similar to other things in your memory. Now, can we remember things that go way back into our childhood? We know from studies that you can interview adults over a 4-year time span and ask them about earliest memories. And that's usually, when you're about 3 years old, 4 years old. And interestingly, those early memories, the accounts that people will give, they are fairly consistent over 4 years of interviews. And of course, you can't really remember something before maybe about age 3, suggesting that language is really important for this process. And we do forget things before the age of 3, but then, those early memories perhaps are distinctive and we do remember some information. So going to this distinction, there are certain memories that are called flashbulb memories because they are really associated with strongly emotional events like 9/11 and other sort of distinctive events. COVID, if you ask students today, where were you when you found out that everything shut down with COVID? They might have some sort of a distinctive memory of that experience, like where were they when they found out, that sort of thing. So we have strong emotional reactions. And when you test people in studies, these are very difficult studies today because you need a distinctive event, and then you need to quickly find subjects after this distinctive event. Think about the logistics of that. But fascinatingly, there are published studies on these sorts of experiences. And what they have found, researchers have found, is that there is a fair amount of rapid forgetting during the first year after the event. So you do forget a lot of information, even though it's supposedly this flashbulb distinctive event. The other thing that is interesting in these studies, and this comes up again and again in memory studies of all kinds, is that our confidence does not diminish over time. In other words, don't rely on confidence because confidence doesn't really tell you anything. A lot of times you can feel confident about a memory and you are so wrong. You are so incorrect. So what the flashbulb memory studies show is that, you can have this distinctive event. You think you won't forget any little detail, but the rapid forgetting occurs and then you're still sitting there saying, I remember everything about this event when you don't really. You're just confident about it. The confidence and the accuracy of memory don't always go together. So there are inconsistencies in flashbulb memory that tend to be repeated once they enter memory. So once you make a mistake in recalling something, then you tend to perpetuate that if you're asked about it again and again. So how does this happen? Well, Elizabeth Loftus has done a lot of really fascinating studies to show how memory distortion occurs. So she has eyewitness memory studies where she asks leading questions. Like she'll show subjects a video and then later ask, did another car pass the red Datsuns at the stop sign? And so she'll ask a leading question by inserting a piece of information that's slightly incorrect. And so perhaps the video actually showed a yield sign, not a stop sign. And then the participants later will falsely recall that they saw the stop sign. And, so it just shows you that the post-event information changes the memory that the person has for the experience and distorts it. So false memory creation is probably easier to do than you can ever imagine. So imagine that you are given a study where you ask people about shopping in a mall. And so Loftus and colleagues presented scenarios like telling subjects, you went shopping with your mom and your cousin. Somehow you wandered away in the store and got lost. A security guard found you later and you were reunited with your mom about an hour later. And this event never happened to the subject. Never happened. They even did all the work. They checked with the moms of the subjects in the study just to make sure, like that this person was never lost in the mall. So the event did not occur. This is a false event. But after initial questioning, about a third of subjects recalled the details of the false event. And after repeated questioning, 25% stuck with their memory of the false event. In other words, something that didn't occur, you can tell somebody that, you tell them this totally fictitious memory and then they truly believe it occurred, right? It becomes incorporated into their memory. You think, oh, well, that's just like a one-off study. That can't possibly be replicated again and again. And no, It's fairly robust. So, for example, I love the Deese, Roediger, and McDermott paradigm. It's very interesting. You present subjects with lists of words that kind of have a theme, like dark, dream, pillow, nap, night, quiet. And in all these studies, the subject studies the list of words. And then later you present them with the words and you say, is this word on the list or not on the list? And if you give them a word like sleep, which is related to all the words on the list, but not actually on the list, 80% of subjects will falsely recognize that word being on the list, even though it was never on the list. In other words, it is fairly easy to, you know, lead someone in the direction so that they remember something that never occurred. Okay, so we're talking about memory failures. On the flip side, are there things that we can do to help memory consolidation? So the interesting thing is that stimulant drugs given after learning can enhance memory consolidation. So there's obviously a brain process that can make memories more crystal clear. Also, in fMRI studies, they have found that greater activation of the hippocampus during learning, when there's more activation, there's better odds of accurate retrieval. So, you know, there's obviously brain processes that are going to make memory better and more accurate. Other processes that are going to make memory less accurate and maybe prone to error or even false memories. Okay, so just to recap, a few things about memory. Real world memory probably uses schemas to actively organize information, and that is what you bring to the table when your memory is being formed. You're just not walking in as an empty brain. Your brain has life experiences, you know things, and when you are learning information and putting it in long-term memory and using it later and retrieving it and using it later, all of that other things that you know about your world, you bring to the table when you make memory judgments. Autobiographical memory is probably more durable than laboratory memories. Not surprising, right? Laboratories are set up to be these artificial environments. And so when you give people lists of words to remember, that maybe is not the same thing as real life when you're remembering information. But nevertheless, even vivid flashbulb memories are subject to fair amounts of distortion and error. Remember that confidence and accuracy are not the same thing, right? You can be highly confident about a memory and be so wrong. So confidence and accuracy do not always go together. So just because someone says they're highly confident about something doesn't mean you should necessarily trust them. Confidence is not accuracy. Also, studies suggest that suggestion of any kind can lead to the formation of false memories of events that never occurred. This is why it's so important in critical times when we need memory, like in police eyewitness testimony, that there are no leading questions. You don't want to lead a witness in the wrong direction by just putting in a tiny detail that's incorrect, because then it gets incorporated into their own memory. So we're understanding now a little bit more about how memory consolidation occurs in the brain and how we can make it better, or the issues that are at play when memory is worse. And so these are all kind of fascinating things. I think some of the things that we are learning about memory are kind of counterintuitive, like the idea that confidence is not a good way to judge that someone is displaying accurate memory. So that's a little bit more about memory.